Digest Fund, connecting artists and communities through jazz, the National Endowment for the Arts, and an additional grant from Columbia Jazz and Tower Records, where the new release entitled Late by Alvin Batiste is featured this month.
Ed Blackwell grew up in the city of Armstrong, Bechet, and drummer Paul Barbaran. He raised himself on Charlie Parker and Max Roach records. He went west to explore the unknown with Ornette Coleman. In New York, where Coleman, John Coltrane, and Thelonious Monk were changing the music, Blackwell played with all of them. He traveled to Africa and discovered where New Orleans came from. At Wesleyan University, he developed his gift for teaching. He used to say, "Neglect your art for one day, and it will neglect you for two."
He wasn't a drummer by choice, he was a drummer by design. Because you know how to stack rhythm, you stack one rhythm on this rhythm, down this one, and then play around that rhythm and play inside of it, But that comes from just full dedication.
He really meant something to the music, and he meant something to me, especially as a friend. He was like a brother to me. And I had always felt that, and I think he might have felt the same way, I could trust him in my life.
I'm Branford Marcellus, and this time on Jazz Set, drummers Max Roach, Billy Higgins, and Gerard Faurot, with pianist Ellis Marcellus, trumpeter Don Cherry, bassist Charlie Hayden, and saxophonist Joe Lovano, tell the story of Ed Blackwell. The story begins in New Orleans, where Edward Joseph Blackwell was born on October 10, 1929. New Orleans is the only city in the American South where the slaves had been permitted to manufacture or play the drums of their native Africa. In the 1930s, drums in the streets of New Orleans often signified a funeral, one of Blackwell's earliest memories.
Sometimes I'd be sitting at the table eating, and I'd hear this thing, this vibration coming with the doom, 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 doom. I said, "Oh man, that sounds like a parade." And I'd jump up and run outside, man, and my sister and my father said, "Come on back, finish your dinner, man." I'd be out the front door, man. And I'm going following this parade, man. It was something else. And that was almost every Sunday, And
Ed Blackwell was always a drummer. As a child, he made sticks from the rungs of his mother's chairs and played drums on the stairs for hours. At Booker T. Washington High School, he drummed in the marching band until his blisters burst. Ellis Marcellus was a few years younger than Blackwell and attended a rival academy.
Well, the New Orleans had the best drummers in the world. Drummers from New Orleans was always considered to be the better ones.
One was a student named Wilbur Hogan, who taught Blackwell to read music and coached him into the band. The other drummer Blackwell revered was Max Roach, but that comes a little later. After high school, Blackwell and some friends played in the house bands at clubs around town, such as the infamous Dewdrop Inn. Blackwell.
we used to play there quite a bit for what we call vaudeville acts. We would have to play for tap dancers, belly dancers, fire dancers, vocalists, shake dancers, and that was my schooling of experience.
The other side of his education came from Bird.
Yeah, that was my school. Listening at the early Charlie Parker records, you know, Dewey Square, you know, all these records. I had a drum shop. The owner of this drum shop, he used to order these records directly from New York for me. Even before they got to New Orleans on the radio, I would get them privately. You know.
In the middle 50s, Ellis Marcellus decided to drive with his Blackwell to Los Angeles.
It was a long ride, very long. We didn't have much money. Like, I don't know if we had any. What Blackwell would do, he would play the snare drum. He had a snare drum on his lap. He knew all of these Charlie Parker songs, and he would play them on the drum, sort of like name that tune, as played by the drummer. Edward knew it so well and could articulate it on the drums in such a way that you'd have to be deaf not to hear it. He was just that precise.
Charlie Parker Records introduced Blackwell to the drums of Max Roach. Blackwell knew all Max's solos. It was in Los Angeles that Blackwell and saxophonist Ornette Coleman became friends and musically inseparable partners. Blackwell.
We started living together. In order to survive, we worked at 2 different department stores. I was the stock clerk, and Ornette was the elevator operator. That's where we would survive in order to pay the rent and just play every day.
Coleman had a very unique sound and style. He was no one's clone. After their workdays at Mays and Bullock's, they came home and played music all night. Sometimes they went to jam sessions, but other players kept them off the stand. Ornette's music was too different. More than once, Blackwell was told, "We like the way you play, but not him." This, of course, didn't loosen Blackwell's commitment to Ornette's music one bit.
We love to play. That's how we got really so tight, because otherwise it could never have been like that unless we had really lived and played together for quite a while. I've been used to playing this AABA type of thing with most musicians, and when I went on that, it got to be something else, like it was either AAAA or BBBB, whatever. It was just the way on that felt, you know, and I learned to play after a while to really listen and play at the same time.
Sometimes they jammed in a friend's garage studio in Watts, where trumpeter Don Cherry and drummer Billy Higgins first heard them. Higgins noticed that Blackwell was playing a drum set of his own creation. One of the modifications, despite his New Orleans heritage, was that he used a miniature bass drum.
He sounded like a marching band, you know, New Orleans marching band, but modern, because he used the cymbals and the tom-toms and the drums different than I'd seen anybody else use them. He was always trying these different patterns with rhythms and working out stuff between his hands, the independence of his feet. He was like a mad scientist, you know what I mean, with the drums.
He was good with his hands and inventive. He taped his sticks or glued hard rubber balls to the tips to make mallets. Don Cherry remembers what it was that Blackwell played on those drums.
Blackwell had this independence. His concept, like Ornette's concept, was harmonic, and Blackwell's concept was independence, whether he could play, like for instance, with his sock cymbal, 1, 2, 3, that's his sock cymbal would be going there, and then his bass drum would be going boom, 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 simultaneously with the and then with his hands, you know, and his tom-tom and snare, blibbity-bidum, blibbity-dum, blibbity-bidum, 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 boom, blibbity-bidum, blibbity-dum, blibbity-bidum, 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 boom, 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 dum-da-dum, boom, 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 and they're all going at the same time, and that's the independence.
Blackwell returned home and joined Ellis Marcellus with Alvin and Harold Batiste in the American Jazz Quintet. They made one of the first and only modern records to come from the cradle of jazz and the home of rhythm and blues.
He was not a drummer for all seasons. He was only concerned largely about playing his drums the way he wanted to and with who he wanted to play with. Because, I mean, he could be in a situation where the rent was due and there was a job playing some music he didn't like, and he wouldn't play. Because he'd rather just stay at home and practice his instrument and work on something.
One night in 1959, the New Orleans police came to his home and arrested Blackwell and Francis Cobble and jailed them on the charge of miscegenation, marriage or cohabitation between persons of different races. This was a felony violation which could lead to 5 years hard labor for the both of them. His friends bailed Blackwell out first. 6 days later, there was enough money to come back and get Francis. She phoned Ornette Coleman in New York as soon as she was free. He needed a drummer for a gig at the 5 Spot, so he sent for Blackwell. Francis joined later. Don Cherry was Ornette's trumpeter.
I actually remember the day that Blackwell had arrived to the 5 Spot, because we were waiting in front for him to come from the airport, and he came straight to the club with his bags and practice pads and drum mallets that he was making. You know, he would make mallets. But, I mean, it was a long time, and when he got out of the taxi, because him and the taxi driver was having a confrontation, because, you know, he was in New York now, coming from New Orleans, and he knew that everybody, you had to be up on your P's and Q's, and he was that way.
A journalist wrote later, everyone came down to check out this new music. They walked in with curiosity and walked out with an opinion. The run lasted 6 nights a week for 7 months, and Coleman brought in new compositions every night.
Ornette would never count the sound on 1, 2, 3, 4, go like that. It would always be that we would feel the silence, and then we would feel each other to start the song. And the first sound of the composition would determine the tempo and the feeling of the groove of the sound. You know, we would hear and listen to each other, and whichever one would have it, we would follow. It's a great way of improvised music.
One of the many musicians who heard this seminal group at the 5 Spot was Max Roach.
Ornette he's different and unique, and as a musician he had his own voice that you could identify immediately. You know, you just heard 1 or 2 notes and you'd say that's Ornette. Ed Blackwell was like, it seemed like Ornette had this whole band of people that he found who were like, and Ed Blackwell was like the icing on the cake for the drummers.
Coleman wrote that Blackwell plays his drums so close to the notes of the tempered scale that sometimes he couldn't tell them apart. This is TNT from their album Ornette.